Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a lecture on argument fallacies, an introductory lecture. I will begin by describing arguments and the different kinds of arguments. Then I will define fallacies. And I will look at some common types of fallacies. And then I will show you some websites to go to examine other types of fallacies, and end with some ideas about how to spot fallacies. So to begin, let's look at the different types of arguments. An argument itself is a series of statements, some of which the premises support, another of which the conclusion. We have two examples here. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. These statements are three. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And two of them, the first two, all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, support the final one, Socrates is mortal, which is the conclusion. Arguments do not necessarily come in this form, so the premises might come second, the conclusion might come in the middle, so you have to be careful. Sometimes we have indicator words like therefore, which point to the conclusion. So you have to think carefully about what the argument is trying to prove to you. The second argument we have here is whenever it snows over a foot, school is canceled. The meteorologist said we have a 75% chance of more than a foot of snow Thursday. Therefore, school is likely to be closed Thursday. Again, the argument is set up with the conclusion coming last, but that is not necessarily so. We could have started with school is likely to be closed Thursday and then went into the other two statements. You can see from these two arguments that a statement is simply a claim. So all men are mortal is a claim. We have evidence for that. We see people who die every day. That's the definition of mortal. So when we're looking at statements, we're not talking about questions or commands. We're thinking simply about claims which can be true or false, or which we can argue is true or false. If you have other questions about arguments, then I encourage you to review my earlier lecture on arguments, which is also on my YouTube site. Arguments come in different kinds, deductive and inductive. In a deductive argument, these are the least common types of arguments. The premises necessarily entail or have a necessary connection to the conclusion, so that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Now, it's important to recognize that when we talk about necessity here, we're not talking about how one thinks or feels, but about the way the argument is created. And again, I encourage you to look into websites or my previous lecture on deductive arguments to think more about this. Deductive arguments can be valid or invalid. Valid and invalid applies only to deductive arguments, so you would never use these terms to describe an inductive argument. Further, they only talk about the logical form of the argument. They say nothing about the truth of the argument. A valid argument is a deductive argument in which is structured so that it has necessity intended for a deductive argument. An invalid argument lacks that structure. So that if an argument is invalid, then that means it is deductive, but that there is a logical error that prevents the conclusion necessitating the truth of, it prevents the premises from necessitating the truth of the conclusion. A sound or unsound argument applies to a valid deductive argument. A sound argument is a valid argument that has true premises. An unsound argument is a valid argument that has false premises. So when we use the term sound or unsound, again, we're talking only about deductive arguments. And I remind you that most often the arguments that we look at, particularly in everyday life and in ethics, will not be deductive. That means that most of the arguments that we examine in our everyday lives are inductive. Inductive arguments mean that the premises probably support the truth of the conclusion. That is, if the premises are true, then most likely the conclusion is also true. Here we have strong or weak arguments. A strong inductive argument means that there is a high probability of the truth of the premises. And a weak argument is that the premises have a weak probability. So it's the difference, say, between an 80% chance and a 35% chance. Cogent inductive arguments are ones with true premises. So a cogent inductive argument is going to be strong and has true premises. And a non-cogent will be either strong or weak and has false premises. Now, when we look at arguments, what we have to look at are the kinds of problems that we might find in arguments that make the truth or falsity of them more or less likely or somehow inhibit that problem. So a fallacy is a common defective argument. It is, in short, a flaw in the reasoning in the argument. There are fallacies within deductive reasoning and fallacies with inductive reasoning. I'm only going to talk about fallacies in inductive reasoning here. We can think of these fallacies as kinds of tricks or illusions that might trick both the person making the argument as well as the audience. Common fallacies are typically named. So what we're looking for here are weaknesses in arguments that impact the structure of the argument, that impact the way that the conclusions and the premises are connected to each other. A common fallacy is begging the question, also known as circular reasoning. You'll hear this one often in moral debates, but also in everyday debates. Here, we presume the conclusion in supporting the premises as true, or another way of stating this is that we use the same statement as both a premise and conclusion. The classic example that is used in logic text is, I believe in God because the Bible says God exists, and I believe in the Bible because God wrote it. Obviously, if the second statement is true, that God wrote it, then we're presuming that God exists, but we're trying to argue that God exists. Here, it might be difficult to figure out what the conclusion is and what the premises are, and that would be a good sign that we're dealing with some kind of circular reasoning. An ad hominem argument is an attack on the person. This is these days also called an appeal to the person. I find the language of appeal to the person confusing and awkward. What we're really trying to do is attack the person and the person's credibility rather than attacking the argument or the premises of the argument. An example here would be the Pope argued that abortion is immoral because abortion kills an innocent life. But the Pope is a man and cannot have an abortion. Here, rather than looking at the argument that's presented, abortion is immoral because it kills an innocent life, we're instead looking at the person making the argument, the Pope, and we're attacking that person. The Pope is a man and cannot have an abortion. Those of us living in 21st century United States and other democracies find these kinds of arguments every day in life. Common with Barack Obama, common with Donald Trump, common with many politicians, using them against each other. And of course, we use them in our everyday lives to attack the politicians rather than the arguments that are being made. Equivocation is an interesting fallacy. It assigns two different meanings to the same term in the argument. So when we're looking at equivocation, that means that we're using a term in two premises, but that the term means different things in each premise. Classic example is the following. Killing innocent humans is immoral. The fetus is human. Therefore, abortion which kills fetuses is immoral. Here, the term human seems to have different meanings, or possibly has different meanings. So killing innocent humans, we're talking here about human beings. This is an important reason to keep these terms clear. If we're talking about human beings, we should say human beings. Human itself is an adjective and not a noun, even though we typically use this as a noun. The fetus is human is a more controversial statement. Here, we might mean simply that the fetus has come from a human or that it is a human fetus, but we do not mean necessarily that it is a human being, or the more interesting claim that the human being is a person. So often in the first statement, killing innocent humans, not only do we mean human beings, but we mean persons. And in the second statement, we do not necessarily know whether we are talking about human beings or talking about persons. Again, there are arguments to support these claims, and I encourage you to read articles on abortion to understand what a human being is and the relationship between human being and persons. But in this argument, often we see these terms used interchangeably when they do not mean the same thing. Another popular argument is the straw man or straw person argument. Here we misrepresent the opposition's argument in weak terms. For example, the professor said that euthanasia was justified if it relieves suffering. He thinks we should just kill everyone who is sick, therefore euthanasia is immoral. Here we're not attacking the professor, we're representing his argument that euthanasia relieves suffering as saying that anyone who is sick should be killed. It's not the same kind of argument that the professor is making, and it should be obvious that that would be the case. However, we run into straw man arguments every day, and so I caution you to be careful about what kind of argument you're looking at. The slippery slope argument uses premises to argue that if we allow one thing to happen, then another thing will necessarily happen that we cannot allow. The classic example here is that if we allow voluntary euthanasia, then soon doctors will kill people against their will. It's the idea that if we start at the top of a hill with voluntary euthanasia, we will end up sliding down that hill, sliding down the slope until we're just killing people against their wills. Now, I have problems with this fallacy. I find it a dubious fallacy. And I think rather than calling something a slippery slope fallacy, we have to look at the historical facts and human psychology. There is evidence to suggest, for example, that by allowing voluntary euthanasia in the Netherlands, soon doctors were in fact practicing involuntary euthanasia. So what we have to look at here is what is human psychology that allows us to move further and further along a particular line until an endpoint. It doesn't mean that by making this step we will necessarily do that. It means that we have to think about carefully where human psychology takes us. Those are some common fallacies, and I want to show you two websites. The first one is logicalfallacies.info. Here you'll see some explanations of fallacies. This is a little more technical, and if you're in a logic class, I recommend that you go here. But you'll see some discussion of informal fallacies as well. If you're not in a logic class, then I would recommend skipping this first page and looking more on the side here at the different types of fallacies. We've already talked about ad hominem. We've also talked about the equivocation fallacy and the straw man fallacy, but you can see that there are a number of fallacies here. If you are looking at an argument and you can't place a name to the fallacy, you might come here for some definitions. Another place that you might look is yourlogicalfallacyis.com. And here it gives us an understanding, a little definition about what a fallacy is, and then you can click here to examine different types of fallacies. And so you see there's a number here that you can click on and look at the different kinds of fallacies. And you'll notice that there are several fallacies that I have not addressed in this lecture. Those are some good resources to use if you want to continue your investigation of fallacies, or if you really want to figure out why an argument is problematic. I want to end briefly by just stating that there are some steps that you can go through to spot fallacies. Obviously, reading the argument and writing down the conclusions and premises separately and trying to draw on a piece of paper the connections between them can help you recognize the relationship. Then you have to ask yourself, does it look or smell fishy? Do you have prejudices here that will make you read the argument wrong? Ask help from others. Do your research and most importantly, check your own emotions about the topic.